Let's do that hockey.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Dobber Prospects Radio. This is episode 131. I'm still your host. My name's Peter Harling. And on today's episode, I am joined by the McKeens Director of Scouting, Brock Otten. Brock, welcome back to the DPR show.
Hey, thanks for having me again, Peter.
Yeah, man, it's good to see you at the draft as well. I like the draft. It's an annual event, minus the COVID interruptions that allowed the writers and the scouting community and whatnot to kind of all get together. It's kind of like the prom for the hockey season, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I like that. Yeah, but it really was a lot of fun to be in Montreal this year, and it was great to see everybody again or meet everybody for the first time for some faces. So yeah, what an event it was for sure.
All right, and the fantasy hockey season is like the NHL season, just around the corner, and a lot of you will be doing your fantasy hockey prep. You got your drafts coming up. If you haven't already done so, you'll be looking at who to keep, who to turn over on your roster. And, you listen to this podcast, Brock and myself, we consider ourselves to be more prospect experts than NHL experts, perhaps. And being the director of scouting over at McKeens, Brock certainly wears that hat of the eye for the young talent. And I do as well, hosting this show and working for Dobber Prospects. So we were both asked to contribute, of course, to the McKeens annual yearbook. I've been a contributor for 5 or 6 years, I think now. And Brock obviously plays a huge role in it, being the director of their scouting. So I asked Brock, and he kindly agreed to come on the episode, and let's talk a little bit about preparing for the fantasy hockey season that's upcoming and how you can use the McKeens guide for that. So I've been buying this since it was a print magazine like 15 years ago. I've been a long time buyer of the McKeens book. I love it that it has a really good and reliable forecasting for what we think the players are going to do. It breaks them down by team, gives you blurbs on the top players, and the prospect coverage on it has really expanded over the years as well. I think you probably have a lot to do with that too. And the articles at the beginning of the magazine too, I've loved those since before I was even asked to be a part of it. And the 2 articles that I contributed to the magazine this year that you'll be able to find that are actually published on the site right now. So if you're a McKeens subscriber, you can read along as we talk about these articles. So I've been asked to do the late show again as a continuing article in the yearbook. And I focus on players you can get. And if you're listening to this podcast, these are the kind of guys that you might be looking for, that, you're Calder candidates. Those guys are all long gone. They're all pre-owned in these dynasty leagues that people are in. But this gives you an opportunity to draft some guys who are entering the NHL with a chance of being a hidden gem, kind of coming out of nowhere. And I was also asked this year to produce a prospect rankings, top forwards, defensemen, and goalies. And Brock provided a deep list of Calder rankings. So why don't we start with those 2 articles, Brock? Because there's some pretty good overlap between the 2 of them. Your Calder rankings and my prospect rankings are very similar.
Yeah, let's dive in.
All right. So your Calder rankings is pretty self-explanatory. My prospect rankings is different than the one in the magazine because mine is based on fantasy hockey prospect rankings. And for these rankings, I took into consideration a couple of things. Obviously, what is their upside, right? So they have to be able to be high caliber prospects who are going to be able to produce not only goals and assists for you in your fantasy, but I think a lot of people these days, Brock, are really into the more multi-cat leagues. There's a lot of leagues out there that are scoring more than just goals and assists these days. Hits, blocks, some still do penalty minutes, plus minus, face-off wins. There's a variety of stats you can use. So I tried to incorporate that level of value into these prospects too. So that kind of weighted a little bit for some of the more gritty guys, and it gives some defensemen some better value as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, I think that's a big part of fantasy hockey these days. It's not just goals and assists, depending on what league you're in, right? There could be a variety of different categories, and if you're going to be a league winner, you got to make sure that you're hitting on those other categories as well.
Yep. And I think two driving factors between both our lists were offensive upside, of course, and ETA. Like, how quick and how confident are we that the player we're trying to rank is going to be not only in the NHL this year, as opposed to returning to college or junior or the American Hockey League, but how prominent of a role will they be given? What is the opportunity on that team? Do they have good players to play with? What are the challenges with the depth chart for them to move into a top 6 role or a top D pairing kind of thing? That's pretty safe to say. Am I putting words in your mouth correctly, or is there another important factor that you put into with your Calder ranking?
No, I think you pretty much nailed it, Peter. I think the biggest thing you need to look at, other than obviously talent, is opportunity, right? There are certainly guys on my Calder list that I wrote that are further down the list that I would say are better NHL prospects. They just don't have the same opportunity as some of the guys that I ranked slightly ahead of them. That's obviously the big part of Calder Trophy prediction, right?
Yeah.
Is looking at players who do have a really good opportunity heading into the season, and not just as players who simply make the NHL roster. We're talking about players who are going to have a potentially significant impact on their teams because they're getting that first or second line role or first or second pairing role or for goaltenders, which I don't really think there are any this year, but for goalies, the opportunity to play significant minutes and not just as a sheltered backup.
Right. So I think we're pretty much on a if not the same page, but a very similar page. So for me, I had my rankings done by positional. So my top ranked forward for fantasy hockey prospects is Matty Beniers. And my top ranked prospect for fantasy hockey defenseman is Owen Power. And your Calder rankings went 1-2, Owen Power, Matty Beniers. So, I think we're pretty much in agreement that we're both expecting these players to surefire NHL players and to be thrust into a prominent role where they can make an impact right away.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw what Beniers did at the end of last year, right? He was fantastic for Seattle, and he's going to have every opportunity to play tons of minutes for the Kraken. And obviously that's such a big part of it, like we just talked about, right? Not only is he a talented player, but he's going to be somebody that's going to see immediate minutes for the Kraken. He's going to play on the top power play unit. He's going to play first or second line minutes, probably even close to 18, 19 a game, right, in his rookie year. That's such a perfect storm. I think the thing for Power, I ranked him number one because I believe in him. Owen Power is a type of player that we keep saying, well, maybe there's some upside concerns, and wherever he goes, he completely dominates. So it's just like, at what point do we say this is a player who is going to be a dominant two-way force at the NHL level? I think in terms of his Calder potential, and obviously I think it's going to happen, but I am slightly concerned that he's not going to get the kind of power play minutes that he's going to need to put up some serious offensive production to be a Calder winner from the back end. I think that maybe by the mid-year point, I think he's going to solidify that role on the power play, but I could see them starting him off a little bit slower. They do have some decent depth in Buffalo, so I do think that's a slight concern, and I know I've read that and heard that from other people, but I think he's just too talented of a player to not eventually take over that role.
Right. Well, not too many NHL teams can boast 2 first overall draft picks that are on their blue line. But Buffalo sure can. They've got Rasmus Dahlin and Owen Power there. So I guess that's where the competition will come for power play time for Powers from Rasmus Dahlin. He's got a little bit more experience and tenure under his belt there. So do you see any chance where, so you're saying you could see him working his way into that role? Does that mean that you're suspecting that he is going to usurp Rasmus Dahlin as the number one power play quarterback, and they'll go with him and 4 forwards? Or do you think they'll go 3 forwards and 2D on power play 1?
I think that they'll experiment early on, right? I think Buffalo is as a team that's does have some talent, but they are still younger. They've got one of the best prospect systems in the entire NHL, and they're going to try to work guys in, and they're going to try to figure out what works, not just for this year, but moving forward, right?
Hmm.
Um, you know, having five forwards or four forwards and one defender is sort of the new sexy way to run a power play. Um, but if you've got two guys like Dowling and Power who can control the point, do they look at using both of them in that role? Obviously, Dowling has done a good job. I think he had a good year last year, obviously, with him really taking that next step forward as an offensive defender. I think there's a chance that Power could sort of usurp him in that
Mm.
role. I think that at the very least, I do think that they'll probably go like 60-40. I think at the very least, Power will start on that second power play unit, but it's all going to depend on how they play and whether they want to experiment going with Dallin and Power together, letting them work off of each other. I think that they just have a lot of flexibility, and I think that's something that's going to be key for them moving forward too.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Buffalo shakes that out. Maybe they go with, the forward core of four players who get a minute and a half of the power play time, but they could share that time evenly with the defenseman. It's easier to make a line change with your D while you're on the power play, especially in the second period. The bench is right there. They could just pop over back and forth, or they could just go with the two of them at the same time. There's lots of options there. It's also a little bit more difficult for defensemen to win the Calder Trophy. We had one do it last year with Mo Sider, and he looked pretty good doing it. He was pretty convincing. Not too many people were arguing with that selection. I can't remember the last time we had back-to-back defense win the Calder. So that'll be interesting to see how his season unveils as time progresses this year. Matty Beniers is a player I think has a really good. If I had to take one player to bet on it, I think it would be Beniers for me. I really like his opportunity in Seattle. They added a couple more offensive caliber players to play with him. And like you said, he looked really good at the end of the season, scoring almost a point a game in the last 10. I think he also has the opportunity to provide fantasy owners with a variety of stats too. He scores, he passes, he's a good playmaker. He plays an aggressive forechecking game, so he'll get you some hits. He's very responsible defensively. He comes back deep, so he can get you a few blocks as well. And he's a center, so he'll also draw in some face-off wins. I wouldn't count on him racking up a significant amount of penalty minutes, and if you count plus minus, that could be detrimental because I think Seattle will be a dash by the end of the season. Actually pretty early on throughout the season, so he could be a bad minus for you. But other than that, it's all gravy with Beniers. And if you're in a cap league, these guys are all on ELC deals, so you've got a couple of years of low cost, high reward. So let's move on a little bit. Those are two good players. The next guy you've got listed is Kent Johnson. He'll be joining the Columbus Blue Jackets. Now, you got him ranked third ahead of some pretty high players. Am I guessing that's because you think he's got an opportunity this year to play with one of or both of Patrick Laine and Johnny Gaudreau?
Correct. That's sort of where my line of thinking is. I also think he has a good chance of being on the top power play unit with those guys too, which obviously is going to help him, for lack of a better term, pad his stats, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's just a really good opportunity for him. And I think when you look at some of the other guys that I've got ranked or some of the other guys that are out there as Calder candidates, I think you have to look at Johnson as being somebody who obviously possesses the high end skill necessary to put up offensive numbers. And not only that, but he's got a great opportunity to play with some highly skilled players too. There's an opportunity in Columbus in the top six. Whether it's Kent Johnson, whether it's Kirill Marchenko, they have some young guys that could take hold of that spot, and that's why I've got Johnson at 3.
Yeah, I had him as my fifth ranked forward. I think he's got a lot of offensive upside. I mean, he's a regular goal scorer of the Michigan and played for Michigan in NCAA, so that's a little fun quirk. Do you think he definitely starts on at center in the NHL? Because a lot of times players will transition in a little bit more easy to play position on the wing. There's less defensive responsibilities. Usually players get better as they age on face-off wins as well. So I could see him perhaps breaking in this season on a wing, and then as he gets a little bit more experience, gets a little bit more accustomed to the NHL, gains some coaches' confidence, he could move not only up the roster but back into his center position. Do you think that's a potential way that plays out?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I mean, it makes sense when we look back to the way that you were describing sort of how you created your list and some of the parameters that you sort of set for yourself. And Johnson is going to be a Calder candidate because he's going to put up offensive numbers if he's playing in a significant role. He's getting power play time. But when you look at the way that you sort of broke down your list, looking at some of those other categories, Johnson probably isn't going to be somebody who's going to get you penalty minutes. He's not going to get you hits.
No.
His plus minus probably isn't going to be terrific playing on Columbus this year. I mean, they could be good, but I don't think it's going to be a strength of his. So really, you're looking at him being strictly just point potential, and if your league counts power play goals or power play points, if he's playing in that top power play unit, that's obviously going to be beneficial as well. But he's not going to be sort of that multi-category guy that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and that's one of the factors why he's still in my top five. You can't ignore the silky mitts that he has.
Right.
But you're right. That's pretty much all he's going to contribute, and that's okay for a lot of players in the NHL. Ask players, fantasy owners who own Artemi Panarin, they're probably pretty happy with the amount of assists he produces, and they can get over the lack of hits. Okay, so that's Kent Johnson. I have him as my 5th ranked forward. You've got him as your 3rd Calder candidate, just ahead of Mason McTavish. Now, when you made this rankings, did you do this list before the World Juniors or after?
Before.
Before. Okay. I kind of was curious about that. Now, if you made this list after the World Juniors, would that have moved the needle at all on these two? Would you keep them where they are, or would you flip-flop them?
Keep them.
Keep them, eh? Because Mason McTavish had a pretty impressive World Juniors and just a pretty impressive season entirely, with all the hockey that he played, and looked good everywhere he played.
Yeah, I absolutely love Mason McTavish. I think he's one of the best prospects in the NHL.
Yeah.
But his versatility, I think, will be possibly his undoing as a Calder candidate. Anaheim's pretty deep already, and I just don't know if he's going to put up the kind of points that are going to be necessary to be sort of a top 5 Calder candidate. I think he's got a very, very good shot of being a 2020 guy this year. I think he's probably going to move up and down the lineup. They'll probably put him in a variety of different roles. I think he's got a chance of playing on the top power play unit at different times. But I just don't know if there's sort of that same sort of path that Kent Johnson has for top 6 minutes consistently.
All right. So here's a question for you for Mason McTavish. He still has a year of junior eligibility left, surprisingly enough. He dominated the Ontario Hockey League last year. He looked great playing for Canada at the international tournaments that he played in. I 100% believe that he doesn't have anything to gain from returning to junior anymore. He's not eligible for the American Hockey League, so it's the NHL or back to the Ontario Hockey League for him, or I guess potentially maybe somewhere in Europe. Do you see a scenario where he doesn't make the Ducks roster this year?
No. And that's sort of going back to what I was talking about with his versatility, right? He's going to play in a variety of different roles, and Anaheim will not be sending him back. I really don't think so. I think that even if he's playing on a 3rd or 4th line for them, I think that's going to be more beneficial than going back to the OHL for another year. I mean, he's coming off of a year where he won an OHL championship. Just had a fantastic World Juniors. There's nothing else for him to prove, and I don't think there's any other way that for him to develop as a junior player. I think he needs to be challenged at the NHL level. If that means playing 10 minutes a night on the 3rd or 4th line, I think that that's still the answer. I think that's still the better answer than sending him back to the OHL. And I would be shocked if he goes back. Honestly, shocked. I think the only way it would happen is if somehow, God forbid he gets injured or whatever in camp again, kind of
Hmm.
like last year where he had that injury. I honestly, I don't think he goes back last year unless he gets injured. I truly believe that. So unless that sort of thing happens again, I don't think he goes back. I think he's going to be in the NHL.
Yeah, I'm a staunch believer that players should play out their junior careers until until they dominate at that level, and then they can move on. And if that's 4 years of junior and they dominate as a senior or NCAA and dominate as a senior, and then they need a little bit of time developing it at the pro level in the American Hockey League, then that's what they need. And if they can graduate out of the OHL after dominating as a junior, right, in their third season, well then great. But those players are the outliers and few and far between. And Mason McTavish is an exceptional player. But let me ask you something. If you were knowing what you know now about how his career has progressed and developed and the way he's improved, if you could go back to the Ontario Hockey League priority selection where Shane Wright was granted exceptional status and went first overall and Mason McTavish went second, if you're Kingston, would you still take Shane Wright number one, or would you consider taking Mason McTavish?
I would still take Shane Wright. And that's just because there's that opportunity for him to continue playing as an exceptional status player, right? He's a year younger. So you're going to get possibly that extra year. Obviously, you don't know how McTavish is going to develop and how quickly he's going to become an NHL prospect. Obviously, the expectation was for Wright to do the same thing on the same sort of rapid path. But I would still go Wright just because you have that security of him being that year younger. And I think both of them are fantastic prospects. If you go to my blog when I just did my top prospects from the OHL for the NHL, I have McTavish ahead of Wright, and I do stand by that. I do think that McTavish has a chance to be a more valuable NHL player than Shane Wright does. But still going back in time, even with the knowledge that we have now, I think I would still take Wright because one thing that you and I have chatted about before is the fact that Shane Wright could go back to the OHL this year. He didn't have an amazing draft year, or part of why he fell to fourth. Seattle probably is not in any hurry to rush him. Like we talked about with Beniers, like they're not going to be great this year. There's no reason for them to rush him. If he goes back to the OHL, Kicks it probably deals him. They move him somewhere who some team that's going to be at the top of the standings, and he's going to get another chance to sort of redo last year's disappointing run in the playoffs, and that would be ultimately great for his development. Like you sort of said, I don't think that there's very rarely would I say that going back to junior would hurt a player's development or stagnate a player's development. I think there's always things that they can continue to work on. And I think that speaks volumes to a player's character, right? Taking on challenges with the right mindset, understanding that there's always going to be things that they can get better at. Whereas a guy like Mason McTavish, that's one of those rare instances where I just don't see anything else that he's going to be able to work on at the OHL level, because he's just so much stronger than a lot of the players he'd be playing against, and it almost would be to a disadvantage to his development because he now needs to get up to playing at a quicker pace, playing against stronger defenders, learning how to use space at the NHL level. Whereas Shane Wright, I think there's a lot of things that he could continue to work on at the junior level. Like his ability to play with pace and vary his attacks, and find a little more consistency in his two-way game. And there's just so many different things that he could work on. Do I think that he has a chance of making the NHL this year? Yeah, I think it's probably like a 50-50. I think there's a chance that he goes into camp with Seattle and they say, this is a guy who's not going to hurt himself playing for us this year. We're going to go with him and Beniers 1-2 down the middle, and this is the future. The future is now. Let's see what they can do. I would be shocked if Wright doesn't at least get a multi-game look-see. Obviously, they got up to 9 before they can decide before that ELC kicks in, right? Before they have to burn that year.
Yeah,
I'd be shocked if he doesn't get at least a couple regular season games. Obviously, he's preseason ones, but obviously a couple regular season ones too. And then they sort of make up their mind as to what they want to do with him, depending on his performance.
Right. Well, I don't think it's an absurd question, McTavish versus Wright, because I mean we both have McTavish ranked higher than Wright on both our respective lists. That's an interesting conversation. Let's keep going on through the list though, and talk about some more guys. So let's go and talk about two more players now. I'm really curious about if you remember back at the 20, I think it was 20 draft when Buffalo in the first round drafted Jack Quinn ahead of Marco Rossi. And pretty much everybody in the scouting committee was like, oh, you got the wrong guy from the Ottawa 67s. And, now, so we look back in hindsight, you've got Quinn and Rossi like one after the other on this list, but you've got Quinn just ahead of Rossi. I had Rossi as the second forward on my list. So I think I'm a little higher on Rossi than you might be. So let's talk about those two. At the time of the draft, the consensus opinion, let's say, was that Buffalo made a mistake and drafted the wrong guy. Since then, Jack Quinn has gone on to kind of shut a lot of people's mouths and change their opinions on the subject. He's looked very, very good in the American Hockey League.
Yeah, and I think there needs to be a bit of context here. And when you're saying that most people, thought that they had made a mistake, that Rossi should have gone ahead of Quinn, I was one of the few that didn't think so. I've always been a Jack Quinn guy. Going back to, if you look at my mock draft from back then, I had Quinn, I believe, going higher than Rossi. So it's always been I've always been on Team Quinn. Admittedly, I was a little bit worried 2 years ago when he didn't have a terrific year in the AHL and battled some injuries. He had that sports hernia that kind of, I think, really hindered his ability to perform, in a new environment. And I think you have to look at Quinn as the type of guy who's always been slightly immature physically. And I think that was sort of his issue in the OHL and why it took him so long to become a truly dominant force. And I think that's sort of what we saw at the AHL level last year when he was the AHL Rookie of the Year. He was fantastic. And I think when you give him an opportunity to develop and catch up, for lack of a better term, he's going to perform. He's just such an intelligent player. And as sort of those athletic tools, those athletic skills have caught up to how well he processes the game, you're looking at somebody who I think is maybe not an NHL star, but a really, really good NHL player for a really long time. And that's not to take anything away from Marco Rossi, who I really like too. I just think that I like the position that Quinn is in just a little bit better. I think that, like I said, Buffalo obviously has some good depth and some good talent, but they're also a team that understands that they have a really strong farm system, and they're going to try to work some of those guys in. JJ Peterka is another one that was really, really good last year in the AHL, and I think that they find a spot for both him and Quinn in the NHL lineup this year. I think both of them are ready, and I think both of them are going to turn heads in camp. And I think Jack Quinn is in a spot where I think he's going to get some pretty good ice time playing with some pretty good players. I think he's got an opportunity to really perform well this year. And I think one of the reasons being that Quinn is a really solid overall player too. He understands how to play without the puck. He understands how to play in the defensive end. And I think that's going to really sort of endure him to Buffalo's coaching staff. And that's not, again, Marco Rossi is a similar kind of player. He's a workhorse, strong two-way guy. I just think that there's a little bit better opportunity in Buffalo than Minnesota. And that's, again, Minnesota obviously has a really good team, and they've got some really good talent for Rossi to potentially play with. I don't think it's a guarantee that he's in the NHL this year. I think there's a strong chance. I think Quinn probably has a better chance than Rossi. I do think both will be in the NHL, but when you look at, say, Minnesota, they've got some guys that have some flexibility in terms of their positional flexibility. So there's a strong chance Rossi could kind of grab that second line center role. But you kind of look at the job that Frederick Gaudreau did last year for them and Ryan Hartman as well. Both of them behind Eriksson Ek, or sort of in line with Eriksson Ek. They've got some really good center depth. And do they want to move Rossi to the wing? I don't know. Long story short, I kind of just like where Jack Quinn is right now in relation to Rossi.
I concede that Jack Quinn certainly has the momentum right now. At the draft, I think a lot of people were looking at Marco Rossi as potentially the most NHL ready prospect. And he went very high in a lot of fantasy drafts. And GMs who selected him were thinking, hoping, praying that Marco Rossi would walk straight into the NHL and be on a line one center position playing with Kirill Kaprizov. Now, the pandemic hit, he got COVID real bad, and he had a really, really difficult year. You talk about how Jack Quinn missed some time with injury. Well, Marco Rossi missed an entire season, and that really derailed his momentum and trajectory. And he played the entire season in the American Hockey League last year, getting it back. And as the year went on, he got more comfortable and better. And I think that I'm anticipating that Marco Rossi is going to graduate. Maybe the majority, if not the entire season. You know, he might start the NHL, go down for a cup of coffee in the American Hockey League for a little bit if he has a dry spell, and then come right back up as soon as he gets his momentum back. I like his opportunity. The centers that you named don't have the sort of pedigree that Marco Rossi has. First round draft pick. He's got the golden ticket for walking onto a roster spot if he can hold it down. I don't think those other players either have the the salary cap leverage to hold on to the position if they don't outperform Marco Rossi. That's what they have to do. They have to outperform him. They can't play just as well, because I think Minnesota will give the ice time to the younger player with more upside there. So there's some uncertainty with Rossi, to be sure, immediately. But I think both players have tremendous long-term offensive upside. And I think Marco Rossi gives you a little bit of a slight advantage in the peripheral categories as well. He's really strong on draws, so I like him staying at the center position. He's not a very big guy, but he's pretty strong, so he's not adverse to playing rambunctious and mixing it up a little bit physically, but not a banger by any stretch. So those are two interesting players. We both had Power number one, and the next ranked defenseman you have on your list comes in here, and that's Jake Sanderson of the Ottawa Senators. I had him ranked fourth on my defense prospects. So let's talk a little bit about Sanderson. And neither one of us have very many I don't know, mine are positionally ranked, but you don't have very many defense ranked in your Calder. And like I said earlier on, it's difficult for D to win the Calder, but I think we can both see how a guy like Sanderson should be on this list. And then maybe a little later on, a guy like Perunovich as well. So Sanderson will be making his NHL debut this season. He's going to be attending the Sens rookie camps that are happening this week. I'm a big fan of his. He was a big draft riser in his draft year. I think he's got a really good offensive upside, and I think he'll also be able to play a good physical role as well. Play lots of minutes, should help reduce Thomas Chabot's minutes down to a more earthly level in the next couple of seasons. So you're a big fan of Sanderson. You have him as your number 2 ranked defenseman, and there's not really anyone close after that, is there?
No, and even Sanderson, I think it's more so, did I feel the need to have another defenseman high up on the list? Like you said, I really like Jake Sanderson as a prospect. I think he's going to have a really long NHL career. I just don't know if I'm convinced he's going to have the type of offensive impact this year that's going to allow him to be a serious Calder candidate.
Yeah.
I think that there's, like you said, there is a path for him to jump right into Ottawa's top 4 and be an impact player. But, realistically, is Is he going to be more than like a 25, 30-point guy in his rookie year? It's certainly possible. I think he's talented enough. But I could also see him sort of focusing on the defensive side of things first and getting comfortable there, especially with, him having that hand injury at the end of last year that prevented him from finishing out the year in the NHL, and then prevented him from participating in Senators development camp. So maybe there's a chance that he kind of starts off a little bit slow, sort of gains steam, gains confidence in his offensive game and his ability to carry the puck a little bit more slowly. And obviously, if that's the case, and he's only sort of like a 25, 30-point guy, even if he's playing significant minutes, he's probably not going to be in the top 5 of Calder voting. In terms of impact on his team, I think it'll be significant. In terms of actual Calder voting, I'm not as convinced that he's going to be really high up there. I think that a guy like Power might be the really only true top defensive candidate, for the trophy this year.
Fair enough. I think you're not wrong. I might disagree with you on your next ranked player in the Calder rankings, though. That's Kravtsov, New York Rangers prospect. He's had a couple years, a couple kicks at the can now. Never been able to crack the roster. A little bit of drama surrounds him. Asked for a trade, went home, pouted in the American Hockey League, and then every opportunity he's had to say, "Okay, well, it's time to put up or shut up." He's not really been able to answer that bell. You have him ranked right after Sanderson in your top 10. I didn't have him ranked in my top 30 forwards. I guess I'm just not a believer that he's ever going to stick either with the Rangers or another team in the NHL. Now, he's no longer on a 2-way contract. He's a 1-way contract, so he's not minor eligible anymore. If he doesn't make the Rangers roster, they'll either have to loan him over to Europe or waive him, and I don't think there's much chance he goes through waivers, and that might be his best chance to play top minutes in the NHL is with another team. So I'm clearly not a believer in Vitali Kravtsov, but you are, Brock. So what is it that you're seeing that I'm not?
Well, he's a boom or bust player, right? If he's making the Rangers this year and he's playing, he's going to be somebody that I think has a chance to really have an impact. And put up a lot of points. And if he struggles, he might not be on the roster at all, right? Whether that's with another team, whether that's going back to Europe, I think that remains to be seen. Obviously, he's a big mystery, right? One of the biggest wild cards in terms of prospects heading into this year. I just think that there's such significant upside. And when we're looking at this Calder Trophy list, I think I should preface it by saying that I really think heading into the year, it's a 2-horse race. I think if I was a betting man, it would be either Beniers or Power. I think that those two are really far ahead of anybody else heading into the year in terms of a prognostication. I think there's a really big gap between 1, 2, and the rest of the list. And then it's just about trying to list guys that I think have significant upside.
Well, it wouldn't be much of an article if you only had 2 guys on it.
That I don't know who's reading that one. Yeah, it would be like, thanks, Captain Obvious. Probably would be a lot of memes on me on the internet, probably on Twitter of Captain Obvious and my picture beside it. Why asking why they're paying to read my stuff. Look, like I said, Kravtsov is on my list and relatively high because I think that there is significant upside for him to be a Calder candidate. I think there's significant downside to him not even being in the NHL and heading back to the KHL or moving to another team. But if he moves to another team, he's going to be the same sort of role. Nobody's going to play Kravtsov on the 4th line. If somebody believes in him enough to have him in the NHL, they're going to be giving him ice time and the chance to contribute offensively because that's what he does best. And I think when you're looking at some of the guys that I've got ranked behind him, Slafkovsky, I don't think there's a guarantee that he's in the NHL this year. Shane Wright, not a guarantee he's in the NHL this year. William Eklund's coming off a pretty down year in Sweden, playing for a relatively, I believe, poor San Jose team this year. Cole Perfetti, I don't think there's a guarantee that he's in the NHL So there's when we start going down my list, which I'm sure we'll probably dig in deeper as we further our conversation. I just thought that Kravtsov had among the highest boom potential of other players on this list. And he obviously does or will be given a large opportunity to take hold of a role in the top line in New York, which is going to give him a chance to play with some really good players. Whether he takes hold of that and runs with it remains to be seen.
All right. Well, I don't want to spend 5 hours going through all 25 players that you ranked and 30 forwards that I ranked, because who's got that kind of time? So let's just do a couple of quick thoughts on a few more guys. You just mentioned Slafkovsky and Wright as the next guys on your list. They went in the draft. Slafkovsky went first. Wright went fourth. We already talked a little bit about Wright and how you think that he could benefit from returning to junior, and I think he could as well, although neither one of us would be shocked if he played second line center minutes for Seattle all season and ended up having somewhere between 40 and 60 point season. Now, let's talk a little bit about Slafkovsky. Kind of a surprise to some people, not a super surprise to some. The first overall pick in the NHL draft has a sort of history or tradition of going straight into the NHL from their draft. Owen Power didn't do it last year. Do you think Slafkovsky follows suit there? Because he's got a lot of options where he can play. He can go back to Europe. He can play in the American Hockey League. He can play in the National Hockey League. And I think his rights are even owned in the CHL somewhere. He could play there if Montreal saw fit for that. He's on your list for a Calder candidate. So that stands to reason. You suggest that he's going to make he's going to make the NHL. He makes my list a slightly further down, but my list isn't a Calder list, and I think he's got better long-term upside than he has an immediate impact. So what's your quick thought on where Slafkovsky plays, and if it's in the NHL, what kind of impact he has?
Yeah, I think it's similar to Wright, like we talked about, sort of that 50-50 chance. And I know that's kind of like a cop-out of an answer, but I do truly believe that it's 50-50. I don't think Montreal is going to rush Slafkovsky. I don't think there's any reason for them to. There's a lot riding on his selection, especially given the nature of the publicity of it all, with the draft being in Montreal, with them passing on Wright. They're going to want to make sure that they handle Slafkovsky's development really, really well. Montreal probably is not going to be an extremely competitive team this year. I think the goal is for them to get another high pick in this year's really, really strong draft and continue to build out the rest of their roster. If Slafkovsky comes into camp, can play and proves that he can be a top six winger right away and play on the power play and play with a guy like Nick Suzuki and have the potential to be, an immediate sort of 25, 30 goal scorer, Montreal will take him on the roster. If not, I don't think that they use him in sort of like a third or fourth line role. I think they loan him back to Europe, let him play some top minutes, and then bring him back over next year, or bring him back at the end of the European season and let him play out then. So that's why he's a little bit lower on my list. And like you said, it's kind of non-traditional to see the reigning first overall pick so low on sort of a Calder list, but it's 2 years in a row, right? Power went back to college last year. Now we're seeing him at the top of, or near the top of, both of our lists. So maybe the same thing happens with Slafkovsky next year. Maybe he doesn't make Montreal. Maybe he goes to Europe. Maybe he comes back the following year. The 2023-24 season, and he's at the top of both of our lists then when we're having this conversation a year from now.
Yep. Time will tell, right? That is the ultimate distinction there. So one last player on our list that I want to talk about here is Cole Perfetti. I had him way higher on my list. He's my third ranked fantasy prospect, and he is well down your list here outside the top 10. Obviously you don't think that he's a lock to make the NHL. You just kind of talked about that. I like his chances of playing. I think he plays a game that translates very well to the pro level and the NHL. I like that he has the ability to score a lot of goals, and since he was dubbed Goal Perfetti, he followed that season up by breaking the Cy Young trend and scoring more assists than he did goals. He plays a nice solid two-way game. He's got some decent size. He can provide you with a little bit of hits as well. He could play center or wing. I think he's happier at center. I'm not sure that he starts his NHL career at center, kind of like what we were talking about with Kent Johnson, but I could see him ultimately playing the bulk of his career down the middle with Winnipeg. So what were your concerns with keeping him a little bit lower on the list here, Brock?
Yeah, he does have a very good opportunity. Obviously, there are some sort of holes in Winnipeg's lineup. No more Paul Stastny, no more Andrew Kopp. They're coming off of a year that was extremely disappointing for them as a team. And Perfetti is one of their top prospects. So, obviously they're going to hope that he can come in and play a top six role. I think that this is a really big year for Perfetti's development. 2 years in the AHL now. It's time for him to take that next step. I'm not going to say it's a make or break year for him. He's still a young guy, and with everything that happened in the OHL, with the season being canceled and him having to go to the AHL, a year earlier than he would have usually, that I don't think that was amazing for his development personally. But I think my biggest concern is the same one that I've always kind of had with Perfetti is his pace. I think he's a highly intelligent player, but I don't think that his pace of play and his ability to skate himself out of trouble is at a level that might be NHL ready. I think that there still needs to be more development in that area, especially having watched him a little bit at the AHL level, where I don't think he was a dominant player as of yet. I think when we talk about some of the players who had really good years in the AHL last year, in terms of prospects, we talked about Jack Quinn. I mentioned JJ Peterka. You have Lucas Reichel in Chicago. You have Jacob Pelche in Calgary. Guys who were really, really good in the AHL last year as young players. And I think Perfetti was good, but I don't think he was amazing. And I just still have some moderate concerns about kind of how his game translates, kind of the exact opposite sort of to what you said. I think there are some definite traits that are good, and I could make him a really valuable complementary piece, because he doesn't have to be somebody who can take over games right now. He's going to be able to slot between or beside, depending on position that they use him at, some pretty good players. I just still don't know if his development is at that point where he's going to be somebody who can be consistently counted upon to be an offensive producer. I hope I'm wrong. Like I said, I do think it's a really big year for his development. I think you and I just kind of differ on our opinion there in terms of his projectability at this point.
Are you saying my list isn't a Calder ranking, so it has the longer term aspect to it, right? I see him being a extremely relevant fantasy prospect going forward in his career. Granted, he might not be a real strong Calder candidate this year, but I think his long-term value is very high. Are you on the same page with that, or are you still a little bit cooler on him long-term?
Lukewarm would be probably the best way to describe it. When you look at sort of our prospect rankings at McKeens, which are going to be in that yearbook, Perfetti is 30 or 29th, I believe. Yeah, 29th, which is high. But we've got some guys that I kind of just mentioned, like Lucas Reichel, like Jack Quinn, ranked ahead of him, William Meckland as well, Dylan Gunther. So some guys that I do think at this point probably have a little bit safer upside than Perfetti does. I still like him as a pro. I don't know if I like him as sort of a game breaker. I think he's going to settle into being more of like a solid complementary pro. And I think that's why maybe he's a little bit lower down our list in both instances.
Fair enough. All right. So that covers a good chunk of our top prospects from the 25 Calder rankings, and my prospect rankings were 30 forwards, 20 D, and 10 goalies. So highly encourage everyone to go ahead and subscribe to McKeens A subscription will get you full access to the rankings and our quick thoughts on all the players that we wrote about as well, and why we ranked them, where we ranked them. You can also get access to that 300. And the other article that I wrote, let's talk a little bit about that, Brock, the late show. I've got some hidden gems here. So if you're in a deep dynasty league, and this is probably more for like full keeper leagues that have a full roster, a large size league with like 20 to 30 GMs in it, with, full NHL rosters and 20 plus prospects that you can own and protect as well. So these are some players who are coming up that either were previously unowned, or coming from Europe, coming from the NCAA, unsigned, undrafted free agents who signed recently, perhaps, or prospects who maybe were just undrafted and signed a pro deal and have since become late bloomers and becoming a little bit more fantasy relevant and have really super duper low ownership. And guys you might want to look at claiming as a free agent or off the waiver wire, or drafting them in your re-entry drafts if you have those kind of things. So I have it really broken down into 3 categories: players come from Europe, NCAA, and top prospects. So are there any guys on here, Brock, that you kind of wanted to talk to me about that I had in each category, or is there anyone that jumps out at you that you want to talk about?
I think it'd be better if you sort of took the lead. Talk about some of the guys that maybe you would be curious about my opinion on.
Sure. Well, let's start with the European guys. And I think the one that has garnered the most attention and publicity on is Andrey Kuzmenko. He was second overall in the KHL in scoring last year. Now, we've seen a lot of undrafted Russian players come over as free agents before. Everyone remembers Artemi Panarin, of course. That is the high water benchmark. You've got, what's his name? Vadim Shipashov, who was signed by, I believe it was Vegas, and wasn't able to make any kind of impact and immediately flamed out in North America. And after like about a week or so, found his way back to Russia and his return to, scoring championships in the KHL. A couple years ago, we had one who I was really confident in Nikita Gusev. I was a big fan of the Goose. I thought that he was going to be the golden goose and be the next best Artemi Panarin. And that really flamed out as well. So, you might have a bunch of people who are looking at this and saying, oh, yeah, second in the KHL in scoring, but he's undrafted. So, I'm not a believer. He's got a really good opportunity in Vancouver. It's a 1-year contract. So it's a pretty low risk investment for fantasy GMs if you can just add him for free as a free agent. If you have to draft him in a prospect draft, I would certainly not take him ahead of, at least first half a round, if not full first round of NHL drafted prospects that went in Montreal. But he's the kind of guy who you won't have to spend a lot of investment time on your prospect roster with him. He'll either make it onto your active roster and be an immediate contributor, or he'll be done in short order. That's kind of the way I see him. I haven't got a lot of scouting tape on him from the KHL. I have watched some highlight reels, and he's a very shifty, sneaky player behind the net. He's got good hands. He's very quick. And he's got a nice accurate shot, and he's crafty and creative, like a lot of the high profile prospect kids are these days. Guys like Kent Johnson, guys like Zegras. They're very flashy and very creative, and they're not afraid to try things, and I see shades of that from Kuzmenko. I'm not saying that he's going to be as good as those guys, but I think he has a really legitimate shot at playing in a top 6 role in Vancouver. Love to hear your thoughts on him.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with that last point is, when you're looking at a fantasy draft and you're looking at grabbing players late, you're looking for that sort of boom potential, right? Yes, to a certain degree, depending on what kind of categories your league is using, you might be filling out some of those, hit, face-off, shorthanded goals, penalty minutes categories, right? But you're also looking at those guys that are going to really outperform their draft position. And Kuzmenko has a chance to do that. Like you said, huge gamble, right? There is a chance that he doesn't even last the year in the NHL. Honestly, there is probably that chance, just like we've seen with some of the other KHL stars that have come over, because sometimes the pasture is not greener on the other side, and they're quick to head back where they're already established stars, right? But other than maybe Pettersson, Besser, Horvat, Miller, maybe Connor Garland, I know that they signed and spent a lot of money on Mikheyev, but I'm not convinced that Kuzmenko can't beat him out for a spot in the top 6.
Mm-hmm.
There's an opportunity for him to get significant playing time with good players, and that's ultimately going to possibly lead to really good production. There is a chance that he is the next Panarin in terms of somebody who jumps right into NHL, and is a really good performer. And then there's the flip side of that, like you said, where he's Shibashev or Gusev, or take your name or take your pick of some of the other KHL stars who've come over and done absolutely nothing, and then had to go back to the KHL maybe even mid-year. But that's why he's a sort of deeper sleeper, right? He's not somebody that I would use an early pick on, that's for sure. But if you're looking at players who have really high upside towards the mid to later part of your draft, I think Kuzmenko is a good pick. Like you said, he's skilled enough to obviously put up the numbers. It's just a matter of how that skill set transitions, which is a bit of a mystery. But that's why he's not being drafted in the first couple rounds, right?
Mm-hmm. All right, so there's a couple more players in the European bracket that are coming over. Some are familiar names that you might recognize from, previous stints in the NHL, like Dennis Malgin, and some guys will be making their debuts. Then we got the NCAA class as well. So these are all undrafted free agents, and the top of this list is with a bullet, and that's Ben Meyers, who had a really solid Hobey Baker finalist kind of season as a senior, finished the year in Colorado. But I forget what the loophole was, or the term with his contract, that maybe it was a professional tryout that he signed for the balance of the regular season, but he wasn't able to play in the Stanley Cup finals for in the playoffs for Colorado. But he did play in the World Championships and looked pretty good over there as well. So of all the college free agents, he is the most fantasy relevant by far, and the potential for him to be an impact player got a little bit better as Nazem Kadri walked as a free agent. So that creates a roster opportunity for him. Maybe not to replace Nazem Kadri on the second line center, but if someone moves up the roster, then that opens up a spot a little bit further down for him to start and then potentially play his way up as his career progresses. Do you see him playing in the NHL or in the American Hockey League with the Eagles?
I definitely see him going straight to the NHL. I really like what Meyers brings to the table. I think he had a fantastic year, obviously, at the NCAA level, and I think that he's somebody whose game transitions extremely well, especially when you look at the way that Colorado likes to play. He can bring speed. He's strong at both ends already, really strong away from the puck. But supports play well with pace as well. I'd be shocked if he's not a bottom 6 player for Colorado this year. And if he's performing well in that role, he's somebody that could make sense as a late round flyer, because if somebody gets injured, if somebody underperforms, if he's playing well, they could easily move him up in the lineup and take a look and see what he's capable of doing. I think that the upside is definitely there for him to be, a second line player at the NHL level. And I'm really excited to see what he does this year. He's somebody that I'm very, very curious about in terms of prospect performance coming into the year. And I think the only other one that really, really sticks out for me in terms of NHL free agent or NCAA free agent signings would be Blankenburg in Columbus. I think he's got an opportunity to play a role for them and possibly even get some power play time and put up some good points, maybe as a sort of deeper sleeper in your draft as well from the back end.
Yeah, he comes from Michigan Wolverines, so he was insulated from the limelight quite nicely by Owen Power and Luke Hughes. Luke Hughes, by the way, is my third-ranked defenseman. He's going back to college for another year, so that's what kept him a little bit further down, is he's not going to make an immediate impact. But Blankenburg was, I think, a bit of an unsung hero on that roster as a senior on the team. You know, he was a leader and he provides some really good two-way play on the back end. He's not a very big guy, but he was quite happy to block a lot of shots. So I think that's going to be his meal ticket in the NHL, is his two-way play, perhaps more his defensive game than his offensive game, and and his willingness to do whatever it takes to win games, block shots, score goals, make passes, throw hits. He'll try and do it all. Yeah, I like him as well. I was unable to get him in any of my fantasy leagues, which is a bit of a bummer. So then we got the late bloomers here. So these are prospects who don't have a lot of fanfare for, outside of maybe Nathan Smith. So he played out his 4-year term and was gonna not sign a contract, so he ended up getting traded to Arizona, and the Coyotes were able to sign him. A couple other guys I have on this list as well. Let's maybe talk about Arber Xhekaj.
Sure, yeah.
I talked about him a couple times on podcasts before, but he's right in your backyard here with as an OHL alumni. So if I'm not mistaken, he was undrafted in the Ontario Hockey League, played his way on to a roster, ended up getting traded last season as an overage player to Hamilton, and was a really key component of their team winning a championship and going to the Memorial Cup. He's a really big, physical, 6'4", 225-pound defenseman. Now, he's turning pro this year. He'll be playing in the American Hockey League with Laval, so there's still some wait time on this prospect. And if he does make it to the NHL and goes all the way, I don't think he'll ever be an offensive defenseman, but if you're in a roto multi-cat league, he could be someone who kind of plays a Radko Gudas kind of style value, where he puts up a few points, but he racks up a ton of hits and blocks and penalty minutes. Do I have all my historical facts on Arber Xhekaj correctly? And are you high on him at all? Do you see him having NHL potential?
Absolutely. I remember watching him when he first broke into the league, like you said, as a free agent. And I actually remember being quite impressed by him. His physicality stood out immediately, just his confidence as a young player in the league. His skating has improved tremendously over his OHL career. His confidence and play with the puck has improved tremendously. Pretty much everything about his game has taken, massive leaps forward. And he's now a quality NHL prospect. And I do think that he has a chance at having a long NHL career. I think that he does need to clean some things up in terms of his decision-making with the puck. Some of the things that he gets away with at the OHL level, or even doesn't get away with at the OHL level, some of the turnovers that happen in the defensive end, they're going to have to get cleaned up. He's going to have to make quicker decisions with the puck. But I think that so many other parts of his game will translate really well. And I think that when you look back to when Montreal signed him out of their training camp as a free agent, it was because he was turning heads, and he actually got into some exhibition games, which rarely happens for CHL free agents that aren't aged out. It's a pretty rare feat. And it's obvious that they really think highly of him in that organization. And I think with good reason. I do think that he has a chance to be a quality sort of number 4 through 6 defenseman. And I think he could actually move pretty quickly. I think the biggest wild card is the processing ability with the puck. If he can make better decisions and just kind of like simplify his game a little bit, play to his strengths at the pro level, I think he'll move pretty quickly. I think he's physically ready. He's a massive dude. His hands are gigantic. He is a big young man, and I think that physically he is ready to compete at the NHL level. It's just a matter of whether he's able to handle the pace and the decision making. And we'll ultimately find out at training camp. But I could see him moving pretty quickly through that system, even as strong as that system is.
Yeah, agreed. One of the things that stood out to me, you're talking about his quickness. I found that when I was watching him, he didn't need to be that quick because he was never really out of position for starters. And the guy's 6'4". He's got a huge wingspan and a long stick, and his legs are so long that with just like 2 or 3 effortless looking strides, he covers a lot of ground, and he could take away a lot of lanes and real estate and eliminate options for players and cut out their time and space very rapidly and very effectively and with physical authority if he needs to. All right, so that's a guy from each group for the late round, and the top names from the Calder rankings and the fantasy prospect rankings. Like we were saying before, there's so much more meat to this yearbook. Another great article that's in it is another regular as well, and it is from Scott Cullen, and it's the fantasy what is it called again? Sorry. Oops. Under the Radar Fantasy All-Star Team. So it covers, a few prospects in there, a few guys that have been injured and whatnot, and a lot of breakout candidates. Brock, tell us a little bit about how people can get this magazine, subscribe, and where they can find your work, and if there's anything else in the magazine that I'm forgetting to mention that is a really interesting piece of value that customer readers will get.
Yeah, so they can buy it off of the McKeens website, mckeenshockey.com. You kind of mentioned previously that it used to be in stores. It isn't anymore, but you can actually buy a print copy if that's what you're into. I know there are quite a few people out there who prefer just to have that sort of print copy in their hand to read as opposed to sitting on their phone or their laptop to read something. So that can be ordered off our website as well as the digital copy. You can do it individually, so just the yearbook, or you can do it through a subscription to McKeens, which obviously I would recommend because I think we put out some pretty good content, not just for the draft, but for other stuff as well. In terms of the yearbook, you're getting the articles that you mentioned. You're also getting our top 300 prospects. You're getting each NHL team's top 20 prospects with write-ups. You're getting prognostications on every NHL team heading into the season. So there's just a lot of content, and kind of like you said at the very beginning, even before I started working for McKeens, I've always purchased the McKeens Yearbook because I think it's being sort of at the top of its class for forecasting what's going to happen the coming NHL season, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. And I really do think that you're going to want to pick up a copy of it when it gets released very, very soon.
I agree with that as well. All right, so this is Brock Otten. You can follow him on Twitter at Brock Otten, BROCKOTTEN. I am Peter Harling on Twitter at Farling. If you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and share it on social media. Tell all your friends, subscribe to the show, give me the 5 stars and all those good things. That's pretty much a wrap for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode. Brock, thanks very much for joining me. Appreciate all your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Keep your stick on the ice, everyone.